Hello, Steve D'Agostino again, and welcome to the Basics of MicroPython Part 2. In the last installment, we covered some very important topics to get you started with learning MicroPython so you can begin working with your Raspberry Pi Pico. Now, there's still a few things to cover, but soon we'll dive into the microcontroller itself and try out some fun projects. Okay, so before we get started, recall the last lesson where we covered some basic syntax, including how to print to the shell, how to group instructions through indentation, and how to write a for loop. This time, we're going to go over what's known as a while loop, as well as a few other things like conditionals and comparative operators. Woohoo! All right, let's get started. So if your file indentation.py is not currently open, go to Thani and open it from your Raspberry Pi Pico so that we can write it in, or so that we can write in the editor. You can erase the current for loop and start fresh, but first, let's try something. So make the current loop inoperable by highlighting the entire code, Control A or Command A, depending on Mac or PC, right? And then we're going to hit either Control or Command and the number 3. And you'll notice these little hash marks that show up. Now this is what we call commenting out your code, which basically turns the code off so it doesn't work without having to delete it altogether. So toggling code from being commented to uncommented will come in handy later when you start testing, because sometimes you have lines of code that do or don't work, and this way you can test what does and doesn't work without having to delete and kind of, rewrite it, right? Another thing that comments are good for are just creating text. All commenting something does really is just make it text. Okay, so you can convert code to text and back, or you can just write some text for yourself. And oftentimes what people will do is they'll write something like a note before a piece of code just to kind of define what it is that they're trying to do. It's really helpful once you start working in teams if you get into writing more complicated Python stuff, so that other people, when they look at your code, they know what's going on, so that they can just move forward and see if the code is going to work or not. Okay? All right. So with that said, let's go on ahead and delete this because we know we're not going to use this again. All right? Moving forward, while loops. So while loops differ from for loops in that they're designed not to perform instructions a set number of times, but rather while certain conditions are met. Okay, so while loops, as a result, can sometimes create what are known as infinite loops, which basically means that they go on and on and on and on and on forever until you stop them. Okay, if the only condition we want to specify is that our program is to run, then that's what we're creating, an infinite loop. In this case, we'll want to make use of the stop icon so that we can, stop the loop if it's continuing on and on, right? So the way we tell the program to run is simply by stating while true. Now, if you remember when we created our first loop, it was a for loop, and we would say for this and range that or whatever, and then we would put a colon at the end of it. And that's the same thing that we're going to do here. Now, before I had also mentioned Booleans. So basically what we're saying here is while true. And what we're saying with while true is just saying while this program is running. And then we hit enter or return, and you'll notice that it's indented just like the for loop, and we will say print loop running. All right, we'll save that, and we will hit run, and oops, we had a little error here. these need to match. All right, so we save that and we hit run and boom. All right, it's running super fast. So you notice how fast it's running. Well, an infinite loop, once it starts running super fast like that, it can chew up resources, and it's not something that we want to do. It can cause crashes and that sort of thing. So obviously we don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do to fix that is we are going to import what's called a library. Now I'm going to get into that in another tutorial, but suffice to say for now that we need to import a library of Python that somebody else has written for us so that we can use some basic commands that come from that. And the library we're going to use is called utime. Okay, so we just write import utime there at the end, or at the very top on line 1. And then down here below where we give the instructions, but what we're going to do is we're going to say after each iteration of the instructions being run, we are going to take the utime library and the sleep command from it, and that 1 is telling it to wait 1 second. Okay, so then if we save and run that, you see how it's much slower. It takes a second before it prints the next one. That way we don't get a system overload and a crash. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to say, well, at the end of the loop, we're going to tell it loop stopped or ended or whatever you want to call it. Okay? Now, what's going to happen is this is an infinite loop, which means that loop is never going to end until you tell it to end, until you actually stop the interpreter from running. And if you stop the interpreter from running, it never gets to the point where it actually prints out that loop stopped. It never got to, because it was an infinite loop, and so it never gets to the point where it can even run that instruction. All right, cool. So now that we've written an infinite loop, let's try another kind of while loop that checks for a certain condition. But first, let's create an input so that we can experiment with making the condition we're going to use either true or false. In order to do that, we're going to define a new variable that will be checked for the trueness or lack thereof of the condition. So for this experiment, let's open a new file. And we are going to save it on the Pico as nametest.py. All right. Okay, so when we're defining a variable, basically what it is that we're trying to do is we're trying to you know, I mentioned before in the last video about taking the letter I and assigning it a certain number, and the for loop would tell it what number to assign to it. Well, this time, instead of letting the for loop do it for us, we're going to create an input where we will define exactly what that variable is going to be. And then that variable will be looked at and will be used for its intended purpose. In this case, we're going to call it user name, and we're going to put an equals after it, just a single equals that basically says we are defining this variable. Now, we can define it ourselves and just say, you know, my name is Steve, you know, and then the username, and then anytime I wanted to say Steve anywhere in my code, I would just say username, okay? But in this case, we want it to be variable and change, and we want a user to input what that's going to be. So we're going to create an input, and we're going to ask a question, right? What is your name? Question mark, space, because this input will show up in the shell when we run this, and we want a space after the question mark. So we put that space in there before we close off the string. Okay? We save that. We click run, and boom, the question comes up. What is your name? My name is Steve. And nothing happens. Well, not nothing. What just happened is that username has now been defined as Steve. But we haven't told Thonny what to do with, with that name. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a while loop that's going to look at that name and do something with it. Now, the way that we're going to define or check whether it is the same as or different from or what have you is we're going to use what we call comparison operators. So let's go ahead and start with the beginning of it. So while username is either the same as or different from what we want this loop to say, we're going to either say, so we would say, well, while it is the same, we would use a double equals. Okay, that means equal to. If we want to say, well, anytime that the username is not equal to something, then we would type exclamation point equals. Okay, we also have greater than or equal to, which looks like that. Less than, equal to, less than, greater than, and obviously the less than, greater than are gonna refer to numbers, not, obviously not text. So what we want to do with this particular loop is we're going to check for when something actually is a particular name. And when something is a particular name, we want a result. So in other words, we don't want to loop through when something is the right name here, because the right name is going to give us a single output, and a wrong name is going to reprompt us until we input the correct name. Okay, so this will make sense as we go through. So we'll say exclamation point equals, and let's say the name is Bruce Wayne. Okay, we're going to add our colon at the end. And so anytime that the name is wrong, anytime the name is not Bruce Wayne, we're going to print, "You're not Batman. Try again." And then we are going to reprompt for that username. So every time that any name other than Bruce Wayne is put in, you will get this, "You're not Batman, try again. What's your name?" And then when it finally is Bruce Wayne, we're going to get our result outside of the loop. So all we have to say is print, "You are Batman." All right, and let's see what happens when we run this program. Okay, what is your name? My name is Steve. Something interesting here happened. All right, sorry folks, had to go back, pause my video here and check my code and see what was going on. It looks as though I had forgotten to write the word input up here. So basically what I was doing was I was saying that username was what is your name, and so is what is your name does not equal Bruce Wayne, so it just kept on going and going and going. So now I have put in the input here, so let's see what it says now. All right, what is your name? My name is Steve. Nope, not Batman. My name is Chris. Finxter. Bruce Wayne. Boom, you're Batman, and the loop has ended. Cool. All right, so that's pretty much all you need to know about loops for now, but there's one other neat thing we can do with this comparison that'll have a similar effect, but doesn't use a loop to check a condition's trueness. It's called, yep, you guessed it, a conditional statement. These are used all over the place and use the terms if and else. In a return a result if a certain condition is met, or else return something different if not. All right, in this case it's simpler than using a while loop, but the major difference here is that since we're not running a loop, we're only going to have the instructions performed one time, right? Because that's the whole point of using a loop, is to have instructions run through multiple times. So the way that we're going to do this is we are going to still prompt for a username, okay? But this time, instead of a loop, we're going to say if username equals Bruce Wayne, colon, just like anything else. Or just like with the loops, anytime we're doing any kind of function thing here, we're always going to have that colon there at the end. So if the username is Bruce Wayne, then we're going to print, you are Batman. Now we're only going to do that one instruction. So we'll hit our backspace here. Obviously, if we were doing multiple instructions, then we would continue within that indentation. We'll say else print you are not Batman. No need to say try again, because you're not going to be re-prompted for a name, because this is not a while loop or any kind of loop, right? We'll say that. I like to clear out the shell. We're going to run our program. What is your name? My name is Steve. Okay. Now the reason we just say else up here is because if that condition's not met, then it really doesn't, anything else that you put in there is going to not be Bruce Wayne, right? So if we run it again and we say, what is your name? My name is 3. You're not Batman, right? But if my name is Bruce Wayne, boom, you are Batman, and the code stops, is ready for the next input. All right, cool. So try some different loops and conditionals on your own. Next time we'll start looking at basic Raspberry Pi Pico kits and their components. All right, and then once we go over all that, then we can start looking at how we can actually program the thing to do stuff. Until then, happy coding.